I'll write this as a complete, single story now. The moment Marcus Halloway saw the ambulance parked outside Mrs. Whitfield's house, his stomach dropped so fast he nearly forgot to put his delivery van in park, and when she opened the door herself, alive but trembling, tears streaming down her face, grabbing his wrist with a grip far stronger than any 84-year-old woman should have and whispering, "Don't go yet," he knew that today was not going to be like the other 1,095 days he had spent delivering her groceries. Before we continue this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet power of showing up for someone else even when nobody is watching, I want to invite you to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things for one another, and this story, I promise you, will remind you why that belief matters. Marcus was 31 years old when he first knocked on the pale blue door of the little house at the end of Winslow Lane, carrying 2 paper bags of groceries that smelled faintly of fresh bread and oranges. He had taken the job with green cart deliveries almost by accident, after losing his position at the auto parts warehouse when the company downsized, and at the time, he saw it as nothing more than a temporary way to pay rent while he figured out what came next. He did not expect that this particular delivery route, weaving through the quiet, tree-lined streets of a modest Ohio town called Ashbury Hollow, would become the thread that held together the unraveling pieces of his own life. The woman who answered the door that first afternoon was small in stature but sharp in her gaze, with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She introduced herself simply as Eleanor Whitfield, and she thanked him with a politeness that felt almost old-fashioned, the kind of graciousness that seemed to belong to a different era. She did not invite him in that day. She merely took her bags, said goodbye, and closed the door. Marcus thought nothing more of it. He had dozens of other stops to make, other porches to visit, other faces to forget by the time he reached the next street. But something about Eleanor Whitfield stayed with him. Perhaps it was the loneliness he sensed behind her carefully composed smile, or perhaps it was the way her house, though tidy, seemed to hold an emptiness that no amount of dusting could erase. He noticed there were no other cars in her driveway, no visitors' shoes by the door, no sound of laughter drifting from open windows the way there was at other houses on his route. It was just Eleanor, and her small garden of tomatoes, and the quiet hum of a television left on for company more than entertainment. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to notice patterns in the way Eleanor ordered her groceries. She always requested the same brand of black tea, the same wheat bread, a modest amount of vegetables, and without fail, 2 cans of a particular brand of cat food, though Marcus had never once seen or heard a cat in her home. He wondered about this quietly, the way one wonders about the small mysteries of strangers, but he did not ask. It was not his place, he told himself, to pry into the life of a woman who was, after all, simply a stop on his delivery route. It was in the 3rd month of his deliveries, on a warm September afternoon when the leaves had just begun to turn amber at their edges, that Marcus first saw Eleanor cry. She had come to the door slower than usual, and when she reached for the bags, her hands trembled so badly that a carton of eggs slipped and cracked against the porch tiles. Marcus knelt immediately to help clean up the mess, and when he looked up, he saw tears sliding silently down her weathered cheeks. She apologized profusely, embarrassed, insisting she was simply tired, that her arthritis was acting up, that it was nothing at all. But Marcus, who had lost his own mother 2 years prior to a long illness that had stolen her strength long before it stole her life, recognized something in Eleanor's eyes that he could not ignore. It was the particular exhaustion of a person carrying grief alone. He did not push her to explain. Instead, he simply sat with her for a few minutes on the porch steps, not saying much, just being present, and when he finally rose to leave, Eleanor thanked him in a voice thick with something unspoken. From that day forward, something between them shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Marcus began arriving a few minutes earlier than necessary, and Eleanor began waiting for him with the door already cracked open, a small act of trust that spoke louder than any words could have. As autumn deepened into winter, Marcus learned pieces of Eleanor's story the way one learns the shape of a room in darkness, slowly, through touch and instinct rather than direct sight. She had been married once, to a man named Walter, who had worked most of his life at the local steel mill before it closed and forced early retirement upon him. Walter had passed away nearly 6 years earlier, and Eleanor spoke of him with a tenderness that made Marcus's chest ache, the way she would mention how he liked his coffee, or how he used to hum old songs while fixing things around the house that did not need fixing, simply because he liked to feel useful. She had no children of her own, a fact she mentioned once, briefly, with a flicker of old sorrow crossing her face before she quickly changed the subject to something lighter, the weather, perhaps, or the price of tomatoes that season. Marcus began to understand that Eleanor Whitfield was, in every sense that mattered, entirely alone in the world. Her days were structured around small rituals that gave her life shape, watering her garden in the early morning, listening to the radio at noon, and waiting, every single week, for the sound of Marcus's van pulling into her driveway. He became, without either of them fully realizing it, the most consistent human connection in her life. For Marcus, this realization arrived with a complicated mixture of tenderness and guilt. He thought of his own family, particularly his younger sister Chloe, who lived 2 states away and with whom he had grown distant since their mother's death, the two of them retreating into their own private griefs rather than leaning on each other. He thought about how easy it was to let relationships wither simply through neglect, through the accumulation of small silences that eventually became unbridgeable gaps. Watching Eleanor's isolation made him uncomfortably aware of the ways he, too, had let people slip away. It was around this time, in the depths of that first winter, that Marcus began doing small things for Eleanor that fell outside the boundaries of his job description. He noticed her mailbox door was broken and fixed it with tools from his own toolbox one afternoon while she watched from the porch, insisting she would pay him, though he refused. He noticed the walkway to her house had begun to crack and buckle from tree roots, creating a hazard for a woman whose balance was no longer what it once was, and he spent a Saturday, unpaid and unasked, smoothing gravel over the worst of the unevenness. Eleanor protested every time, telling him he had already done enough simply by bringing her groceries, that he did not need to trouble himself further. But Marcus had begun to understand something important, that for Eleanor, these small acts of care were not trouble at all, but rather the only proof she had that she still mattered to someone in the world. The friendship deepened slowly, the way real friendships often do, through accumulated Tuesdays and Thursdays, through shared cups of tea that Marcus began accepting when his schedule allowed, through conversations that started as pleasantries and grew into genuine exchanges of thought and feeling. Eleanor asked about his life, too, and Marcus found himself telling her things he had not told anyone else, about the guilt he carried over not being present enough during his mother's final months, about his uncertainty regarding his own future, about the quiet fear that he was drifting through life without any real direction or purpose. Eleanor listened with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to understand that most human struggles were, at their core, remarkably similar, regardless of the age or circumstance of the person experiencing them. It was during the second year of their friendship that Marcus finally learned the truth about the cat food. He had asked, gently, one afternoon, curious after nearly a year and a half of quietly wondering. Eleanor's face had grown distant, and for a long moment, Marcus thought she might not answer at all. But then she told him about a small gray cat named Whiskers who had appeared in her garden not long after Walter's death, thin and frightened, and how she had fed him scraps until he trusted her enough to come inside. Whiskers had become her companion for nearly 4 years, sleeping at the foot of her bed, following her from room to room, filling the silence that Walter's absence had left behind. He had died the previous spring, quietly, in his sleep, and Eleanor had continued buying his food out of a habit she could not bring herself to break, as though stopping would make his absence final in a way she was not yet ready to accept. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest upon hearing this story, a recognition of grief's strange persistence, the way it lingers in habits and routines long after the person or creature we loved has gone. He did not offer empty comfort or platitudes. Instead, he simply asked if she would ever consider getting another cat, and Eleanor admitted, quietly, that she was afraid to love something else that she might eventually lose. It was one of the most honest things Marcus had ever heard another person say, and it stayed with him for weeks afterward. If you have ever loved someone and feared the pain of losing them, you already understand the quiet courage it takes to keep loving anyway. This is the heart of Eleanor and Marcus's story, and I hope you will stay with us as it unfolds, because what happens next will remind you why showing up for the people around us, even in small ways, can change the entire course of a life. As the second year of Marcus's delivery stretched on, subtle changes began to appear in Eleanor's health that worried him deeply, though she consistently downplayed them. She grew thinner. Her hands trembled more frequently, not just from arthritis but from something that seemed to run deeper, a fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to resolve. She began forgetting small things, misplacing her reading glasses, repeating stories she had told him just days before, and once, alarmingly, forgetting his name entirely for a brief, terrifying moment before recognition flooded back into her eyes and she apologized, laughing it off as simply getting old. Marcus began researching, quietly and without telling her, the signs of cognitive decline in elderly individuals living alone. He read about isolation's effect on memory and health, about how a lack of social connection could accelerate physical and mental deterioration in ways that were both measurable and tragic. He began to understand that his weekly visits, which he had once considered simply a pleasant part of his job, had likely been doing more to preserve Eleanor's well-being than any medication or doctor's visit could accomplish alone. This realization filled him with a sense of responsibility that felt both heavy and sacred. He started visiting more than just the scheduled delivery days, stopping by on his lunch breaks or after his shifts ended, sometimes bringing small additional items he had noticed she needed, a warmer blanket when the temperatures dropped unexpectedly, a bag of birdseed for the feeder she liked to watch from her kitchen window, a paperback novel by an author she had mentioned enjoying years ago. Eleanor began to refer to him, in a tone of gentle teasing that could not fully disguise her genuine affection, as her boy, though Marcus was nearly her grandson's age, if she had ever had grandchildren at all. It was during this period that Marcus reconnected with his sister Chloe, prompted largely by his growing awareness of how precious and fragile family connections truly were. He called her one evening, uncertain and nervous, and admitted that he missed her, that he regretted the distance that had grown between them since their mother's death, that he did not want to lose the only sibling he had over unspoken grief and pride. Chloe, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this call for nearly 2 years, too afraid to reach out first, assuming Marcus needed space rather than connection. Their reconciliation was not instantaneous or perfect, but it was real, built slowly through phone calls and eventually a visit, and Marcus often credited Eleanor's influence, however indirect, with giving him the courage to reach toward the people he loved rather than retreating from them. He told Eleanor about this reconciliation during one of their Thursday visits, and she had smiled in a way that seemed to hold both pride and something more complicated, a wistfulness that Marcus initially could not place. It was only later, months afterward, that he understood she had been thinking of her own estranged relationships, wounds from her past that had never healed, doors that had closed long before Marcus ever knocked on hers. The third year of Marcus's employment with Green Cart Deliveries brought changes to the company itself. New management arrived, focused heavily on efficiency metrics and delivery times, implementing systems that track drivers' routes with an almost obsessive precision, flagging any deviation from the optimal schedule. Marcus found himself increasingly reprimanded for the extra minutes he spent at Eleanor's house, for the additional stops he made that fell outside his assigned route, for the personal errands that, while unpaid, technically violated the company's new policies regarding driver conduct. His supervisor, a brisk and humorless man named Gary Pemberton, called Marcus into his office one gray afternoon in early spring and informed him, without much preamble, that his route was being reassigned. The company was restructuring delivery zones to maximize efficiency, and Marcus's regular customers, including Eleanor Whitfield, would now be serviced by a different driver entirely. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as Gary spoke, a dread that had nothing to do with his own job security and everything to do with the woman who had, without either of them quite realizing when it happened, become something like family to him. He tried to explain the situation to Gary, tried to articulate why Eleanor's route mattered so much, why consistency and familiarity were not simply inefficiencies to be optimized away but rather essential elements of care for a vulnerable, isolated elderly woman. But Gary, sympathetic though he tried to appear, explained that the company's policies left no room for such exceptions, that personal relationships with customers, however well-intentioned, were considered a liability rather than an asset in the eyes of corporate leadership. The reassignment would take effect within 2 weeks. Marcus left that meeting with a heaviness he had not felt since his mother's funeral. He drove to Eleanor's house that same afternoon, though it was not technically a scheduled delivery day, simply because he did not know how else to process what he was feeling except by sitting with her, the way he always had when life grew complicated. When Eleanor opened the door and saw his face, she immediately knew something was wrong, and Marcus, unable to find gentler words, told her plainly about the reassignment. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marcus began to worry he had said something terribly wrong. But when Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that surprised him. She told him that she had always known, deep down, that this arrangement could not last forever, that good things in her life had a habit of being temporary, and that she was grateful, more grateful than he could possibly understand, for the 3 years of kindness he had shown a lonely old woman who had nothing to offer him in return except tea and conversation. Marcus told her, with an intensity that surprised even himself, that she was wrong, that she had given him far more than she realized, that she had given him a reason to reconnect with his sister, a model of resilience and grace under difficult circumstances, and a friendship that had shaped him into a better version of himself. Eleanor cried then, openly, and Marcus held her hand across the small kitchen table where they had shared so many cups of tea, and he promised her, with a conviction he intended to keep, that losing his official route would not mean losing their friendship. True to his word, Marcus continued visiting Eleanor on his own time, off the clock, driving to Winslow Lane on his days off simply to check on her, to help with small tasks around her house, to sit with her and listen to whatever stories she wished to share that day. The new delivery driver, a young man named Trevor who Marcus met briefly during the handoff period, seemed pleasant enough, but Eleanor confided that his visits felt transactional in a way Marcus's never had, efficient and polite but lacking the warmth that had grown organically between them over 3 years of consistent presence. It was during this period of transition, roughly 4 months after Marcus's official reassignment, that Eleanor's health took a sharp and frightening turn. She began experiencing chest pains that she initially dismissed as indigestion, stubbornly refusing to see a doctor despite Marcus's increasingly worried insistence. It was only when Marcus arrived for one of his unofficial visits and found her slumped in her armchair, pale and struggling to breathe, that the true severity of her condition became impossible to ignore. Marcus called emergency services immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed, staying on the phone with the dispatcher while simultaneously trying to keep Eleanor calm and conscious. The minutes before the ambulance arrived felt like hours, each second stretching unbearably as Marcus held Eleanor's hand and spoke to her in a steady voice he did not actually feel, reassuring her that help was coming, that she needed to stay with him, that she could not leave him now after everything they had built together. The ambulance arrived, and Eleanor was rushed to Ashbury Hollow General Hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with a serious cardiac event that, had it gone untreated for even another hour, likely would have proven fatal. Marcus followed the ambulance in his own car, breaking several traffic laws in his panic, and spent the following hours pacing the hospital waiting room, calling Chloe for support, and praying, though he was not a particularly religious man, that Eleanor would pull through. She did pull through, though the recovery was slow and fraught with complications. The doctors informed Marcus, who had listed himself as her emergency contact given the absence of any living relatives, that Eleanor's heart had sustained damage that would require significant lifestyle adjustments moving forward, medication management, and crucially, a support system that could ensure she was not left alone for extended periods, particularly in the initial months of recovery. This last requirement presented an immediate and pressing problem, as Eleanor had no family to call upon, and the reality of her isolation, which Marcus had witnessed gradually over 3 years, was now being stated plainly by medical professionals as a genuine risk to her survival. It was in the hospital room, several days into her recovery, that Eleanor first mentioned the words that would come to define the story's turning point. Marcus had visited every single day since her admission, sometimes multiple times, bringing her favorite tea in a thermos since the hospital's offerings failed to meet her exacting standards, sitting with her through the long, monotonous hours of recovery, holding her hand during the frightening moments when new tests were run or new concerns arose. On one particular afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window and Eleanor seemed more like herself than she had in days, she took Marcus's hand and told him, with a seriousness that stilled the room, that she needed to tell him something she had been carrying for a very long time, something she had never told another living soul. She explained that many years ago, before Marcus had even been born, she and Walter had a daughter named Margaret, born prematurely and struggling from her very first breath. The doctors at the time, working with far less advanced medical technology than existed today, had done everything they could, but Margaret had passed away after only 11 days of life. Eleanor described the grief that followed as a kind of drowning, an all-consuming darkness that she and Walter navigated separately rather than together, each of them retreating into private sorrow rather than leaning on one another, a pattern that had subtly poisoned their marriage for years afterward, even as they maintained the appearance of a stable, loving partnership to the outside world. She told Marcus that they had never had another child, whether by choice or by circumstance she did not fully explain, and that the absence of children, of grandchildren, of any living connection to carry forward their family's story, had become the great sorrow of her later years, a sorrow made sharper by Walter's eventual death and her subsequent isolation. She confessed that she had watched Marcus, over these 3 years, with a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief, gratitude for his kindness and grief for the fact that circumstances had never allowed her to have a son or grandson of her own to show such kindness toward her naturally, out of familial obligation rather than choice. Marcus listened to this confession with tears streaming freely down his face, understanding for the first time the full depth of the loneliness that had shaped Eleanor's life, and the profound significance that his simple, consistent presence had held for her. He told her, his voice thick with emotion, that whatever the circumstances of their meeting, whatever label society might place on their relationship, she was family to him now, in every way that mattered, and that he intended to remain in her life for as long as she would have him. It was this conversation, and the vulnerability it represented, that led Eleanor to make the request that would eventually bring us to the moment described at the very beginning of this story. Following her hospital discharge roughly 2 weeks later, Eleanor returned home with strict medical instructions requiring regular monitoring and assistance, instructions that filled Marcus with anxiety given the reality of her continued isolation. He began visiting daily, adjusting his own work schedule and personal life to accommodate her needs, a sacrifice that strained his finances and his time but one he made without hesitation or resentment. It was roughly 3 weeks after her return home, on a bright Tuesday morning in early June, that Marcus arrived for his daily visit and noticed an ambulance already parked in Eleanor's driveway, its lights flashing silently in the morning sun. His heart seized with terror as he parked haphazardly and ran toward the house, images of losing her flooding his mind with a force that nearly buckled his knees. But when Eleanor herself opened the door, alive and standing, though clearly shaken and crying, Marcus felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought him to his own knees on her front porch. It turned out that Eleanor had experienced a fall in her bathroom that morning, a fall that, while frightening, had not resulted in any serious injury beyond bruising and shock. The paramedics, already on scene, had checked her vital signs and determined that hospitalization was not necessary, though they recommended she not be left alone for the remainder of the day. It was in this moment of vulnerability, with paramedics packing up their equipment in the background and Eleanor's hands still trembling from the scare, that she reached out and grabbed Marcus's wrist, saying the words that would echo through the rest of their shared story, "Don't go yet." But the phrase, Marcus would come to understand in the hours and days that followed, carried a weight far beyond the immediate circumstances of her fall. As they sat together in her living room that afternoon, Eleanor sipping tea with hands that still shook slightly, she explained that the fall had frightened her not simply because of the physical danger, but because it had forced her to confront, in a visceral and immediate way, the reality of her own mortality and the terrifying prospect of dying alone, with no one nearby to help her, no one to notice if days passed without contact, no one to mourn her passing beyond perfunctory community. Acknowledgement. She told Marcus that she had been thinking, in the weeks since her hospitalization, about the fragility of the life she had built for herself, a life that had been sustained almost entirely by his presence and kindness, a foundation that felt suddenly precarious given how easily circumstances, whether corporate policy or his own personal life, could have taken him away from her permanently. She admitted, with a vulnerability that clearly cost her considerable pride, that she was afraid, more afraid than she had been in years, and that she needed him to understand the full weight of what his presence meant to her, not simply as a kind gesture from a grocery delivery driver, but as the central relationship sustaining her will to continue living. Marcus, moved beyond words by this admission, made a decision in that moment that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. He told Eleanor that he had been considering, for several weeks already, a proposal that he had been too nervous to voice, uncertain of how she might receive it. He explained that his own living situation, a small apartment across town, had never felt like a true home, merely a place to sleep between shifts, and that he had begun to wonder whether a different arrangement might benefit them both. He asked Eleanor, with a directness born of the day's emotional intensity, whether she would consider allowing him to move into the spare bedroom of her house, not as a formal caregiver receiving payment, but as family, sharing expenses and responsibilities the way any two people who cared for one another might. Eleanor's response was to weep, though this time the tears carried a different quality than the fear and grief that had characterized her crying earlier that day. She told Marcus that she had not dared to hope for such an arrangement, had assumed it would be an imposition too great to ask of a young man with his own life to build, and that his offer represented a kindness beyond anything she had imagined possible for herself in these later years of her life. The following weeks brought significant changes to both their lives as Marcus began the process of moving his modest belongings into Eleanor's home. His sister Chloe, upon hearing the news during one of their now regular phone calls, expressed initial concern about the practical and legal complications such an arrangement might present, questions about caregiving responsibilities, financial entanglements, and the emotional risks of Marcus tying his life so closely to a woman in her mid-80s with a serious cardiac condition. But when Chloe finally met Eleanor in person, driving up for a weekend visit roughly a month after Marcus's move, she understood immediately the depth of genuine affection and family-like bond that had grown between them, and any reservations she held dissolved into genuine warmth toward the woman her brother had chosen to make his family. The arrangement was not without its challenges. Marcus had to find new employment given the demands of caregiving, eventually taking a position with more flexible hours at a local hardware store where the owner, a kind man named Douglas Ferris, proved understanding of Marcus's occasional need to leave suddenly for medical appointments or emergencies. Eleanor, for her part, had to learn to accept help gracefully, a skill that did not come naturally to a woman who had spent decades pridefully managing her own affairs, but she made genuine efforts, recognizing that her stubbornness, however understandable, placed unfair burdens on the young man who had chosen to share his life with her. Their days together developed their own rhythm, one built around Eleanor's medical needs but also around simple pleasures that brought genuine joy to both their lives. Marcus began cooking meals in Eleanor's kitchen, learning her preferences and adjusting recipes to accommodate her heart-healthy dietary restrictions, and Eleanor, in turn, began teaching Marcus things she had learned over her long life: how to properly tend a garden, how to repair small household items with patience rather than frustration. Stories about the history of Ashbury Hollow and the people who had shaped it over generations. Marcus found himself absorbing not just practical knowledge but a kind of wisdom about resilience and grace that he suspected would shape the rest of his own life. It was roughly 6 months into this new living arrangement, as autumn once again painted the trees around Winslow Lane in brilliant amber and crimson, that Eleanor raised the subject of the gray cat once more, this time with a different tone than the fear and reluctance she had expressed years earlier. She told Marcus that she had been thinking about Whiskers, about the joy he had brought into her life during a period of profound loneliness, and that she felt, perhaps for the first time since his death, ready to open her heart to that particular kind of love again. Marcus, delighted by this shift, drove her to the local animal shelter that very weekend, where they found a small orange tabby kitten with mismatched eyes and an insatiable curiosity that immediately captured both their hearts. Eleanor named him Walter, after her late husband, a decision that brought tears to her eyes as she made it, tears that Marcus understood now carried both grief and healing in equal measure. The introduction of young Walter the cat into their household brought a new layer of warmth and life to Eleanor's home, his playful antics providing entertainment and laughter that echoed through rooms that had, for so many years, held mostly silence. Marcus often found Eleanor sitting in her armchair by the window, Walter curled contentedly in her lap, a look of peaceful contentment on her face that he had rarely witnessed during the earlier years of their friendship, when her loneliness, however bravely concealed, had cast a persistent shadow over her days. As the story of Marcus and Eleanor's unusual family began to spread through the small community of Ashbury Hollow, largely through the natural channels of small-town conversation and genuine admiration for their bond, other members of the community began reaching out with their own offers of support and connection. A retired teacher named Patricia Sullivan, who lived 2 streets over and had known Eleanor casually for decades without ever forming a deeper friendship, began visiting regularly, drawn by Marcus and Eleanor's example to reconsider her own patterns of social isolation following her husband's death several years earlier. A younger family who had recently moved to the neighborhood, the Hendersons, began inviting Eleanor to their home for holiday celebrations, their children delighting in what they came to call Grandma Eleanor, a title that brought Eleanor to tears the first time she heard it, given the daughter she had lost so many decades before. This expanding circle of community connection did not diminish the special bond between Marcus and Eleanor, but rather seemed to validate and celebrate it, transforming what had begun as an unlikely friendship between a delivery driver and his elderly customer into something the entire community recognized as a model of the kind of care and connection that too often goes missing in modern life. Marcus found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, becoming something of a local advocate for elder care and community support, speaking occasionally at local community center gatherings about the importance of checking in on isolated neighbors, of recognizing that small acts of consistent kindness could quite literally save lives. It was during one of these community gatherings, held at the Ashbury Hollow Community Center on a bright spring afternoon nearly 2 years after Marcus had first knocked on Eleanor's pale blue door, that Eleanor herself, now walking with the assistance of a cane but otherwise remarkably improved in both her physical and emotional health, stood before the assembled crowd to share her own perspective on the story that had transformed her final years. She spoke of the terror of isolation, of the particular grief of aging without family, of the way that society often overlooks its elderly citizens, treating them as burdens rather than as people with rich histories and continued capacity for connection and joy. She spoke of Marcus not simply as a caregiver or even as a friend, but as the son she had never had the chance to raise, a gift that had arrived in her life disguised as a grocery delivery, proof that the universe, or fate, or simply the quiet accumulation of one person's consistent kindness, could rewrite even the loneliest of stories. Marcus, standing in the audience that day, found himself overwhelmed with emotion as he listened to Eleanor's words, understanding fully, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what their unlikely friendship had accomplished, not just for Eleanor's individual well-being, but for the broader fabric of their community's understanding of connection, care, and the radical power of simply showing up for another person, week after week, year after year, without expectation of reward or recognition. If this story has touched something in you, I want you to take a moment right now and think about the people in your own life who might be quietly struggling with loneliness, whether an elderly neighbor, a distant family member, or even a coworker who seems to be carrying more than they let on. Consider reaching out today, even with something as simple as a phone call or a brief visit, because you never know what kind of profound difference your presence might make in someone else's life. And if you believe, as I do, that stories like this one deserve to be shared more widely, that the world needs more reminders of kindness and connection and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your own thoughts on what this story means to you, share it with someone in your life who might need this message today, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story like this one from our growing community of people who believe in the power of showing up for one another. Before we reach the conclusion of this story, I would love to hear from you directly. If you have ever experienced a moment where a small act of kindness, whether given or received, changed the course of your life or someone else's, please share that story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find hope in their own difficult circumstances. The final chapter of this story, at least the chapter that brings us to where things stand today, unfolded gradually over the following 2 years, as Marcus and Eleanor's household continued to flourish in ways neither of them could have predicted when Marcus first knocked on that pale blue door with 2 paper bags of groceries in his arms. Eleanor's health, while never fully restored to what it had been before her cardiac event, stabilized considerably under Marcus's attentive care and the emotional support that came from no longer facing her days in isolation. She celebrated her 86th birthday surrounded by the community that had grown around her, Marcus and Chloe, Patricia Sullivan, the Henderson family with their now teenage children who still called her Grandma Eleanor, and even Douglas Ferris from the hardware store, who had become an unlikely friend through his employment of Marcus. Marcus, for his part, found in his relationship with Eleanor a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded him during the aimless years following his mother's death and his job loss at the auto parts warehouse. He eventually returned to school part-time, pursuing a degree in social work, inspired directly by his experiences caring for Eleanor and his growing understanding of how much good could be accomplished through dedicated attention to the needs of society's most isolated members. Eleanor, delighted by this development, insisted on attending his eventual graduation ceremony, sitting in the front row with Walter the cat's photograph tucked into her purse, having decided the actual cat, now grown into a dignified and somewhat aloof adult, was better left at home. Chloe, too, became a regular presence in Eleanor's life, the distance between the siblings having been fully bridged through their shared love for the woman who had become, in every sense that mattered, their grandmother. She would visit monthly, bringing her own young daughter along on these trips as she grew older, introducing a new generation to the remarkable woman whose loneliness had once been so profound but who now found herself surrounded by more love and connection than she had known even during the early years of her marriage to Walter. The garden that Eleanor had once tended alone, a small source of purpose during her isolated years, expanded under Marcus's enthusiastic if initially clumsy efforts, growing to include not just her modest tomato patch but a small vegetable garden that the Henderson children helped tend, learning about growing their own food while spending time with their adopted grandmother. Eleanor often remarked that the garden had become a metaphor for her own life during these later years, something that had once felt small and solitary blooming into something abundant and shared, nourished by the consistent care of people who had chosen to show up, day after day, season after season. There were, of course, difficult moments woven through these years of growth and healing. Eleanor experienced a second, though less severe, cardiac episode during her 87th year, a frightening reminder of her mortality that brought Marcus back to that familiar hospital waiting room, though this time surrounded by the wider community of support that had grown around them both. She recovered, though more slowly this time, and the experience prompted difficult but necessary conversations about end-of-life wishes, conversations that Marcus approached with the same steady presence he had brought to every other challenge in their shared life together. Eleanor, with a clarity that Marcus found both heartbreaking and reassuring, expressed her gratitude that whatever time remained to her would be spent surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, rather than facing her final years in the isolation that had once seemed her inevitable fate. It was during one of these tender conversations, held on the front porch where their friendship had first taken root 3 years earlier, that Eleanor told Marcus something that he would carry with him for the rest of his own life. She told him that she had spent much of her later years believing that her story was essentially finished, that the loss of her daughter, the slow decline of her marriage into polite distance, and the eventual loneliness of widowhood represented the final, unchangeable shape of her life's narrative. But Marcus's persistent kindness, beginning with something as simple as remembering her tea preferences and noticing when she seemed troubled, had taught her that stories could be rewritten even in their final chapters, that it was never too late to experience genuine connection and love, and that sometimes the family we need most arrives not through blood or circumstance, but through the simple, radical choice to show up for another person, again and again, until showing up becomes not an obligation but a joy. Marcus, hearing these words, understood that his own life had been equally transformed by their friendship. He had arrived at Eleanor's door 3 years earlier as a man adrift, uncertain of his purpose, distanced from his own family, simply going through the motions of a job he had taken out of necessity rather than passion. Eleanor had given him, in exchange for groceries and small kindnesses, a sense of purpose that had reshaped the entire trajectory of his life, reconnecting him with his sister, guiding him toward a career in social work that felt genuinely meaningful, and teaching him, through her own example, the particular grace required to face life's hardships with dignity and continued openness to love and connection. If you have made it this far in our story today, I want to ask you something important before we reach our conclusion. In the comments below, please share what this story has taught you about the power of showing up for others, or perhaps share a memory of someone in your own life who showed up for you during a difficult season, someone whose consistent kindness changed your trajectory in ways they may never have fully realized. Your reflection might be exactly the encouragement someone else needs to read today. As I bring this story to its close, I want you to imagine, if you will, the scene that greets visitors to Eleanor Whitfield's home today, nearly 3.5 years since that pale blue door first opened to reveal Marcus standing on the porch with 2 paper bags of groceries. The house on Winslow Lane has become something of an unofficial gathering place for the small community that grew up around Eleanor and Marcus's friendship, a home filled regularly with laughter, with the sound of the Henderson children playing in the expanded garden, with Chloe's daughter's delighted squeals as she chases Walter the cat around the living room furniture, with Patricia Sullivan and Eleanor sharing tea and conversation on the front porch during warm afternoons, with Douglas Ferris occasionally stopping by after Marcus's shifts at the hardware store to share news of the neighborhood. Eleanor, now 88 years old, moves more slowly than she once did, relies more heavily on her cane and occasionally on a wheelchair for longer excursions, but her eyes retain the same sharp intelligence and warmth that Marcus first noticed all those years ago, and her laugh, once so rare during those early lonely years, now fills her home with a regularity that brings tears of gratitude to anyone who witnessed the isolation of her earlier circumstances. She continues to mentor Marcus, now completing the final year of his social work degree, offering perspective drawn from her own long life whenever he faces particularly difficult cases or emotional challenges in his coursework and fieldwork placements. Marcus, for his part, has become something of a quiet legend within the local social work community, his story of transforming a simple delivery job into a life-changing friendship serving as inspiration for a new generation of social workers and community volunteers who understand that meaningful change often begins not with grand gestures but with the simple, consistent choice to notice and care for the people we encounter in our daily lives, however brief or seemingly insignificant those encounters might initially appear. The story of Marcus Halloway and Eleanor Whitfield reminds us, I think, of something essential about the human need for connection, something that transcends the boundaries we often place around relationships, whether defined by blood, by transaction, or by the arbitrary categories society uses to determine who deserves our care and attention. It reminds us that loneliness, particularly among our elderly population, represents one of the great hidden tragedies of modern life, but also that this tragedy can be addressed, can be healed, through the simple radical choice to show up consistently for another human being, to notice their struggles, to offer small kindnesses without expectation of reward, and to remain present through both the joyful and difficult seasons that inevitably characterize any genuine relationship. Eleanor once told Marcus, during one of their many porch conversations, that she believed everyone carries within them the capacity to be someone else's miracle, that we need not wait for extraordinary circumstances or special qualifications to make a profound difference in another person's life, that sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer another human being is simply our consistent, genuine presence, our willingness to notice when they are struggling, and our courage to reach out even when we are uncertain of how that reaching out might be received. If this story has touched your heart today, if you believe, as Eleanor and Marcus have taught us, in the transformative power of kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment right now to like this video, to leave a meaningful comment sharing what this story means to you, to share it with someone in your life who might need this message of hope today, and to subscribe to our channel so that you continue to be part of our growing community of people who believe that ordinary acts of kindness can create extraordinary, life-changing connections. Our family here believes deeply in stories like this one, stories that remind us of our shared humanity and our capacity for profound compassion even amid the busy, often disconnected pace of modern life. As we close this chapter of Marcus and Eleanor's remarkable friendship, I want to leave you with a simple thought to carry with you today. Somewhere in your own community, Perhaps on your own street, there is likely someone quietly struggling with the particular pain of isolation and loneliness, someone who has, like Eleanor once did, resigned themselves to believing that their story has essentially concluded, that connection and joy belong to earlier chapters of life rather than remaining possibilities for whatever time remains to them. You may never know, unless you take that first step of genuine kindness, whether you might become for that person what Marcus became for Eleanor, a source of connection so profound that it quite literally saves a life and rewrites its final chapters into something rich with continued meaning, joy, and love. Thank you for joining our community today in celebrating this story of unlikely family, radical kindness, and the enduring hope that it is truly never too late for our lives to be transformed by the simple, powerful choice to show up for one another.